Grace and peace be yours in abundance. This is Season 7 of Guerrilla Christianity. My name is Pastor Brett Walker, and I'd like to thank you for listening to Guerrilla Christianity, an unconventional, no-apologies exposition of God's grace from an evangelical Methodist point of view. Now, the Word of God is central to all we believe, so let's get into God's Word right now. Welcome to another edition of GC Talk. My name is Brett Walker, and I am the pastor at Hudson United Methodist Church in Pedricktown and Ebenezer United Methodist Church in Auburn. With me today is Zach Taylor, pastor at New Hope United Methodist Church in Penns Grove. And our topic for today is we're talking about COVID-19. Everybody seems to be talking about it, but what we're going to do, we're going to talk about it from a religious perspective, a biblical perspective, the perspective of the believer, because there's so many differing opinions right now in what's going on, and very extreme to one side or the other. So the question is, COVID-19, is it a punishment from God, or is it simply a biological plague with no heavenly cause whatsoever? So that's what we're talking about today. I'm sure, Zach, like me, you've heard both sides of the argument. We see a lot on Facebook and the Twitterverse, and everybody seems to have an opinion. And of course, nobody's opinion is ever wrong, right? And we can't let facts get in the way of a good opinion.
Exactly.
So what are you seeing, or what's your take on the whole thing?
Well, since last night, I've been really thinking about how I would respond to this, and to tell you the truth, I really don't know. I kind of take a middle ground between two positions. On the one hand, I do believe it's something from God, but not in a punishment sense. I don't think God sent it as a form of punishment for our sins, but as a means to teach us or to get us to draw closer to Him. But there's also biological factors too, people not practicing good hygiene, and it's a fluke strain that just happened to evolve and develop. So I take the middle ground. Yeah, it's from God, but should we freak out that it's the end times or that it's some kind of divine or ordained punishment? No, it's just, I think it's meant to draw us closer to God and to make us think about certain things. And in reading some of Wesley's take on national judgments and miseries and what have you, I think Wesley would say the same thing. It's from God, but we as human beings also have a stake in it. It's our fault too that things like this happen. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I know it's not a solid answer, but that's kind of my thinking at this time on this issue.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sort of in the middle as well.
Yeah.
Of course, I believe in a sovereign God, and so I think that everything is under the control of God.
Yeah.
I also happen to think that if God were trying to punish us in some way, that He would use something a little bit more potent than COVID-19. I mean, right now in the United States, we have 675,000 cases, 34,522 deaths. It's pretty significant. However, there is a lot of people who are just not taking it seriously. And again, if this was something that God was using to punish, the world, because it's not just an American plague, but if this was something that God was using to punish the world, don't you think it would be something a little bit more potent? I mean, the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages claimed the lives of nearly a quarter of the entire population of the world at that time. We're nowhere near those numbers. Right now, we are looking at 2.2 million confirmed cases worldwide out of 7 and some change billion people. So we haven't even hit 1%. But again, I do also believe that God can use this. And if you look at how some people are reacting, well, we can't go to church. People are really uncomfortable with that. I'm not I know a lot of people are not serving communion right now, and a lot of people aren't very comfortable with that either. I would ask the question, well, why is Communion Sunday the lowest attended service of the month? Is it going to be greater now when we come back? I mean, there might be a little bit of a spike in spiritual interest from this, but then again, how much is that going to stick around? I mean, look at how many people went back to church after 9/11 and then immediately fell right away.
Right.
So again, I think if this was going to be something that God is using as a punishment, it would be a little bit more potent than what it is right now. It's got our attention, that's for sure. One thing that I read last week, and this was really interesting. I mean, I know that Hulk Hogan is a believer. I don't know if you've seen this or not. I don't follow the WWE at all, or Yes, I guess it's the WWE now. It used to be the WWF, right?
Yes.
When I was a kid, I used to watch them, and Hulk Hogan was one of my favorites. But he put out a tweet last week, and I thought this was really interesting. He said, God said, you want to worship athletes? I will shut down the stadiums. You want to worship musicians? I will shut down civic centers. You want to worship actors? I will shut down theaters. You want to worship money? I will shut down the economy and collapse the stock market. You don't want to go to church and worship me? I will make it where you can't go to church. And then he posted this quote from 2 Chronicles. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. And then he finishes with this. Maybe we don't need a vaccine. Maybe we need to take this time of isolation from the distractions of the world and have a personal revival where we focus on the only thing in the world that really matters, Jesus. So, interesting. It's an interesting take on it, and this from certainly a lay person, but a person who believes in God and in Jesus Christ. So, right. Again, I don't know that God is punishing us per se, but he certainly has our attention, and I would think.
Absolutely. I agree with that.
So another one that's been going around, is making the rounds, is this letter that Martin Luther wrote during a resurgence of the bubonic plague in 1527. And one of the things that everybody's talking about, well, what would he do? He would, he said, I will keep my distance from people that I don't want to infect. And, a lot of the things that we're seeing today, apart from, washing hands and whatnot. But this is, I found this interesting in his letter. He said, now, if a deadly epidemic strikes, we should stay where we are, make our preparations, and take courage in the fact that we are mutually bound together, as previously indicated, so that we cannot desert one another or flee from one another. First, we can be sure that God's punishment has come upon us, not only to chastise us for our sins, but also to test our faith and love. Our faith in that we may see and experience how we should act toward God, our love in that we may recognize how we should act toward our neighbor. I am of the opinion that all the epidemics, like any plague, are spread among the people by evil spirits who poison the air or who exhale a pestilential breath which puts a deadly poison into the flesh. Nevertheless, this is God's decree and punishment to which we must patiently submit and serve our neighbor, risking our lives in the manner that St. John teaches. If Christ laid down his life for us, we ought also to lay down our lives for the brethren. So, obviously, I think Martin Luther was of a stronger opinion that God causes this rather than God allows it. But I think more of the conservative Christians are saying God causes it, and more of the liberal Christians are saying has nothing to do with God. God didn't do this. God is loving, and he would never cause this.
Right. Or I've also heard, if it is because of God, it's because of politicians that this is coming about. So in other words, it's Donald Trump's fault, or it's the Democrats' fault, or it's a political party's fault that this is happening to us. So I want to quote John Wesley, and it's similar to what Martin Luther says, but Wesley says in his sermon, National Sins and Miseries, and I quote, "God frequently punishes a people for the sins of their rulers because they are generally partakers of their sins in one kind or another. And the righteous judge takes this occasion of punishing them for all their sins." So I take what Wesley is saying is, if a ruler or a leader of a nation would happen to commit sin, then the people under his or her jurisdiction is guilty of that same sin. So, some people that say, well, this is Donald Trump's fault. Well, one could argue there is some merit to that, because Donald Trump being our ruler, then we suffer for, quote unquote, his sins. So it's interesting that Wesley says that, and why some people feel that way. So it's interesting that the political component of this, there's some probably merit to it. Not saying it is Donald Trump's fault or the Democrats' fault, because I don't believe it is. But some people have been saying that, and that has troubled me. But it was interesting to read that from Wesley.
It is interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
We have an issue today also, whereas we are looking at things, and we seem to think that there is a mutual exclusivity between religion and science, that they can't coexist in the same sphere of existence. And one of the things that religious people are often accused of is that we're not intellectual thinkers. We're not people who have a scientific mind, and I don't find that necessarily to be true. Probably one of the smartest scientific minds, Francis Collins, wrote a book called The Language of God. And Francis Collins was the lead geneticist on the Human Genome Project, mapping out the human DNA. And what he saw in human DNA was a progression of information that is stored in our DNA, like we're programmed to a certain extent. Now, the thing about viruses is their whole existence is to infect and replicate. That's all they are made to do. And so what they do is they find a healthy cell. They can't replicate on their own. Like a single-celled creature or a bacterium can reproduce by splitting, and they reproduce their own DNA and create two creatures, if you will, or single cells that are identical to the original. Whereas with a virus, it gets into that single-celled creature. It doesn't have a nucleus of its own, and so it needs another host in order to replicate itself. Now, all that is to say this, because I've been going around and around trying to figure out, well, where do these viruses come from, and what is the purpose of them? And I have to say, as a believer in God and creation, God created them. For what purpose, I don't know, and maybe I'll never know, because these viruses do cause disease. They cause death in a lot of cases. Even the influenza virus, which is pretty tame compared to COVID-19's numbers, it still kills an inordinate number of people every single year. But then you find cases like bacteriophage. Bacteriophage is a virus that it actually will attack and destroy particular cells. And people in Europe, there are scientists in Europe right now who are using this bacteriophage to attack and destroy cancer cells. So this is a virus that is actually being used to cure cancer, if you will. And so the problem is we don't fully understand all of it. And if we understood all of it, if we had perfect knowledge, even in the scientific realm, then we would have figured out a solution to this, months ago. And we wouldn't even be talking about, sheltering in place or face masks or social distancing or shutting down churches or anything.
Right.
So.
But don't you think some of it too has to do with poor hygiene practices? Because I've seen this quite frequently, especially on Facebook, that because people don't wash their hands after they go to the restroom, especially in a public place, or they don't cover their mouth when they cough, or they sneeze on people, and to have no regard whatsoever for anybody else. Do you think that perhaps if we practice better hygiene, that the disaster could have been maybe not necessarily diverted, but it wouldn't have been as tragic or as deadly as it has been? Because I've heard that, some people say if we just practice good hygiene, it would have been averted and we wouldn't have to be worried about it. Only, some cases. So I just would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that hygiene helps to mitigate, but I don't think it completely eliminates the possibility of infection.
Right.
I think you could argue that people in Asia have much better hygiene than we do in America, except when it comes to these wet markets. That's where this whole virus came from, really, is people purchasing exotic animals to eat them, in particular the horseshoe bats. And this is something that the CDC even warned against a long time ago. 2007, the CDC put out a report that said that basically the existence of SARS-like CoV in these horseshoe bats and the cultural practice of eating these animals is a time bomb. That's what they said. It's a time bomb. And I'm looking at everything that is coming out of China right now, and it looks like the time bomb exploded, and here we are again. In New Jersey, we're one of the highest states, just below New York. New York, obviously, with New York City, they've got a real problem up there. And New Jersey's right behind it. We live in one of the lowest incidence counties in New Jersey. If not, I think it's the lowest. I think it's like 80 cases now in Salem County, and 4 deaths, I believe. It's pretty low. That said, it's still a significant thing, and we still need to continue to shelter in place. I'm a little bit alarmed at some of the people who are jumping at the bit and saying we need to end the quarantine, we need to come out of it, we need to get back to, we need a healthy economy and all this stuff. It's like, well, you can't have a healthy economy without workers. And
that's true.
Yeah.
But then so I read an article this morning on a news channel. So Dr. Phil, I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Phil.
Oh, yeah.
I like some of his stuff. I think he's a hack and other things, but he made a really interesting point in this article that I read. He basically said, yes, the virus is an issue and we need to take it seriously. But the other factor, what people aren't factoring in, is the psychological component of this. By staying sheltered in place for so long, it leads to depression, anxiety. He's concerned that there might be a greater increase in suicide because people can't go out and socialize. And it could lead to breakups of marriages and family trauma because people being sheltered in place in houses, there's no release of energy. So there's the psychological component of this, and that's kind of what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the psychological side, because as somebody who suffers with really bad anxiety and insomnia, I need social interaction at times, because being alone, is very stressful for me. So that human interaction is very important, and so it would be interesting to see how long this continues. Now, how people are going to be affected psychologically after this is all over, or if this continues indefinitely. Because there are some reports, CDC, I remember correctly, said we might have to continue this until 2022. And if that's the case, people are going to go absolutely ballistic. I mean, we can't stay sheltered in place for 2 years, can we? I mean, so the psychological component of this, to me, is very interesting, how it'll impact us psychologically.
Right. Of course, I find it very telling that he's basically saying that if we can't get out of our houses, it's going to be mass depression, suicide, all this other stuff, marriages being broken up. Those things were happening before the virus. And I'm not trying to downplay it by any means, but at the same time, that's a worldview that comes from a place of secularism. That's a worldview that doesn't believe in God, that we can do these things, Paul said in his letter to the Philippians, I know what it's like to have want, and I know what it's like to have plenty. And then he says that oft-quoted verse, and I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. In other words, in times of famine and in times of feast, God is with us, and God can get us through. But of course, in our society, we've fallen so far away from a reliance upon God that we think we have to fix the problem. We have to take the bull by the horns, and we have to, it's amazing to me. I just think that there's going to be some serious permanent changes in the way we do things. Mm-hmm. There was a question on the Methodist clergy page today about communion, not about serving on the internet, but how can we go back to a practice of intinction after all of this? Thinking about people all dipping their bread into the common cup. It makes me wonder about, Anglicans who share a common cup and just, wipe the rim. Is that going to be enough? Are we going to be serving communion with gloves on, which is something that I really don't like the idea of, but at the same time, is it a precaution that we're going to have to take? Or are we just going to, eventually we're going to get to a place where we're going to have a vaccine, we're going to have treatment options for this particular virus, and will it just be something that we're it's just another thing that we have to deal with on a regular basis. I do think what you said earlier, though, about hygiene, I do think that our hygiene habits have definitely changed. Yeah. I know for myself, I've washed my hands probably more in the last 30 days than I did my entire life,
Yeah.
But it's also, and you're very careful about how close you are to people, how you, I had to meet a gentleman today who came to the church to check our fire extinguishers, and I'm standing a good 10 feet away from him. Normally, I would go right up to the guy, shake his hand, bring him in the building, but I'm like, you know what? Hey, door's unlocked, help yourself. And you see a lot of precautions at Amazon. We're not only being told to observe social distances, we're actually, it's mandated. They're reviewing tapes, and they're like, if you spend an inordinate amount of time closer than 6 feet to somebody, you're going to get written up. And I'm like, how is that even remotely fair? I mean, here we're working under these conditions. If you're really concerned about our health, close the place down. They're not going to do that because, well, they want to say that they're providing essential services, but the reality is, it's the money.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, there is something to it though, because a lot of people are buying more stuff online and less stuff in stores. That's been going on for years, but now it's even more. If people can't get out, they're just going to, pick up their phone or their tablet and they're going to order what they need.
Exactly. But I've also noticed too the changes in human behavior. I mean, before you could see it, but now you have people who do the necessary precautions, who are very careful, who follow the guidelines and stuff. And then you have those who are very nasty and belligerent to workers at a grocery store, who are frustrated by the inconvenience of things, who are being demanding. Why is the grocery store out of toilet paper? You're supposed to supply toilet paper. Well, I mean, people panic ball toilet paper. What are you going to do? They're doing the best they can. So human behavior is also changing. How we, I was shocked when this pandemic actually broke out, how reliant we are upon stuff and how we're so driven by consumption. The more stuff we have, the more secure we feel. And it's like, now could we possibly learn how to live without instead of having to keep consuming more and more than we actually need to? And I'm starting to see that trend, that now we can actually function without having so much stuff. I know I am. That's changed for me. I'm not buying as much as I used to because I could go without. So it'd be interesting to see if people adopt those kinds of habits, that they don't have to consume so much, knowing that there's very limited quantities.
Yeah, definitely been a big difference around here. Yeah. you're constantly thinking about, this thing that I'm consuming right now. When is the next time I'm going to be able to get it?
Right.
And honestly, the one thing, and I talked about it. I think I posted about it on my Facebook page. I talked about it with a couple of people. But the one thing that really set me off was when I went to ShopRite one time, and the entire rack of bananas was gone. Like,
I remember that.
I'm like, yeah, I'm saying, why are you hoarding bananas? Who's hoarding bananas? They go bad in like 3 days, But again, I'm taking it personally because that was something that I needed. I need those bananas,
Right.
But ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I texted, I sent a text to Aaron, and I wasn't being serious. I was just joking around, but I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go around and lick everything in the store, But this is where we come to,
Yeah.
And I guess, so that brings me back to our original question, which is, is it something? Is all this something that we're dealing with, something from God? And you know what? I do think that God allows these things. I'm not saying that they're out of God's control. They're certainly well within God's control. But God allows these things not necessarily as a punishment. I mean, think about what Jesus said. We're talking about the Tower of Siloam that had fallen, and he said, do you think that those were worse sinners than you? And then he said, no. And if you do not likewise repent, you too shall perish. Going back to what you were talking about, the sermon from John Wesley on national misery, right? He said, or suffering, and he said, the text that he used was when David had staved off a plague that he caused. He took a census of the people, which was a sin, because he was basically trying to say, look how great I am, and then God offered him 3 options as a punishment. You can either fall into the hands of your enemies for 3 years, no, for 30 years, or you can you can suffer a famine for 3 years, or you can suffer a plague for 3 days, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he chose the plague, and he said, I'll put my life in the hands of the Lord, because he will be merciful. If I am put into the hands of my enemies, I may be destroyed. So God sends this plague, 70,000 people die. And the text that Wesley used was, I have sinned, but these sheep, what have they done? The reality is every single one of us has sinned. Every single one of us. And there's nothing that we could say that we're not being punished for, And so in that regard, you can say that these things could be seen as a punishment. Again, and people always say, well, why would God condemn somebody to hell for eternity for just telling one lie? Well, first of all, I want you to show me the one person in the world who's only ever told one lie in their life. Okay?
Exactly.
But second of all, it has to do with the level of authority against which you tell a lie. So if my child comes to me and tells me a lie, I'm going to punish them, okay, severely for telling me a lie. If I tell a lie to my child, there's nothing they can do to me because they have no authority over me. Okay. If I tell a lie to my wife, I might spend a couple nights on the couch, right?
Yeah.
If I tell a lie to my boss, I could lose my job. If I tell a lie to the government, I could be put into jail. So with different levels of authority, the same sin, if you will, garners a stiffer punishment. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
God is the ultimate authority. God is eternal. Therefore, even one sin that I commit against him is deserving of eternal punishment. no matter how little I might think it is, or inconsequential or insignificant, that doesn't matter. What matters is he's the judge, he's the authority, and he's eternal, and he is infinite. And so
Right.
my punishment is going to be eternal and infinite. So people bristle at the idea that COVID-19 is somehow a punishment. And again, I think it's somewhere in the middle. Charles Wesley wrote this sermon about the cause and cure of earthquakes, and he was talking about an earthquake that had happened rather recently in Padua, I think it was, in Spain. And this was a city that had become increasingly secular, in Wesley's time. And he says this, he says, now that God is himself the author and sin the moral cause of earthquakes, whatever the natural cause may be, cannot be denied by any who believe the scriptures, for these are they which testify of him, that it is God which removeth the mountains and overturneth them in his anger, which shaketh the earth out of her place, and the pillars thereof tremble. That's a quote from Job chapter 9. So, at the end of the day, we believe in a sovereign God, a God who has all things under his control, and that means that ultimately this is caused by God. What he's using it for, we don't know. You start to see some of these things. You start to see how people are reacting, especially people are more interested in spiritual things. I'm seeing a lot of people attending our church through Facebook. Now, whether they're going to attend after we're allowed to come together again, that remains to be seen. But you see that God uses a tragedy to bring about and work salvation in the hearts of people. And so I think that's where we're at with this. So
it's certainly a wake-up call. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking of a term of spiritual pride. I mean, you're having some pastors I've been reading on Facebook who are defying the stay-at-home orders and holding church services. And I think one of them contracted the virus and passed away. Yep. And it's like spiritual pride. I think what this is doing is it's revealing spiritual pride that, no, we don't have all the answers. No, sometimes we're wrong, and we just have to trust God. So spiritual pride, I think, is a big factor in what's going on. And I think that's what God is trying to show us, that we've been very vain and prideful in our spirituality and our worship of him. But going back really quickly to what you were saying about punishment, we just got through Easter, and, some people say that, how could Jesus bear the punishment for our sins? Isn't it unjust of God to punish Jesus for our sins? Well, no, because Jesus, in his perfection, in his goodness, having come from God, in order for us to be redeemed, in order for us to get into right relationship with God, Jesus had to bear that punishment. So it's not unjust or wrong or morally reprehensible for Jesus to bear a punishment. I mean, that's the good news, right? I mean, here Jesus was willingly wanting to take the punishment on our behalf so that we could be free from that. So, I always scoff at people who make that argument, oh, it's unjust. Well, then it kind of defeats the purpose of the atonement, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. So we had a question on the Guerrilla Christianity Facebook page. It says, this is Kathy asked the question, Jesus talked about signs of his return. There would be earthquakes and rumors of war, etc. Is this COVID-19 crisis a sign of his second coming? Well, to say that we're living in the end times is pretty apparent, but I don't think that, the plague itself, there have been other plagues. We've had, just in the last decade, we've had SARS, Zika, West Nile. We've had all these different things that come about, and certainly pestilence is one of the signs of his coming. But I think if you read in Matthew chapter 24, he talks about see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. So, beginning of the birth pains. When a woman goes into labor, she doesn't have the baby like 2 seconds later, right?
Right.
It's a long process. And that's what Jesus was saying. This is just the beginning. He says, they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Well, you're seeing a lot of that Christian persecution in other places. There are Christians in this nation who are saying that what we're seeing is persecution. I don't think that's what it is. I think, honestly, it's prudence, or pragmatism right now that's basically saying, hey, don't go to church because, and we have other ways of worshiping. We've shown that we're doing it online. Now, I find remarks like Governor Cuomo's, or not Cuomo, it was Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, who said, hey, if these churches are going to continue to meet, we're going to shut them down forever. We're just going to take your building. That's a step too far. That goes beyond what is allowed in the First Amendment as far as religious freedom and the infringement of free expression. So that, I think, is a bridge too far.
Well, I think a lot of the reaction is just a sign of the end times. I remember, what was the recent one? There was a pestilence 2 years ago. But anyway, I remember West Nile virus, SARS, MERS, all them. I don't ever remember having to shelter in place. I don't remember this adverse reaction to these other pestilences. How come this one, there's such an adverse reaction to it, and the other ones there wasn't? So I think that's where people are coming from. It's how come this one is being seen as like this deadly pestilence, and the other ones were like kind of swept under the rug as if, I mean, the worst one I remember is West Nile virus. I mean, everyone panicked over West Nile virus, but we didn't have to shelter in place. We didn't have to radically change our lives. It's wear bug spray and you won't get bit by a mosquito. So I think that's kind of where people are coming from. How come what makes this one so different than the other ones we've experienced in the past?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the way it spreads.
Yeah.
Obviously with Zika and with West Nile, those were spread by, those are insect borne.
Yeah.
And, what are you going to do? Where are you going to hide from them?
Right.
And their advice is exactly right. Wear bug spray. With this one, it's being passed from person to person, either through breath or by touching surfaces, and it's more deadly than simple flu, influenza.
Right.
I'm looking at the statistics right here. 2.2 million infected worldwide and 145,000 deaths. That's pretty significant,
I would say.
Yeah. Now, with the Spanish flu, and the Spanish flu hit in 1918, I know in the United States, there was something like 30 million infections and 675,000 deaths. We're nowhere near that right now. We're at the number of confirmed cases, 675,000 confirmed cases, but 34,522 deceased as of today. Those are today's numbers. And that's roughly 0.5%, which doesn't sound like a whole lot. And, when you look at bubonic plague, it's certainly not those numbers. But considering that the incidence of death in influenza is less than 1/100%, okay, that's a significant number. This is 0.5%. That's 5 deaths out of 1,000. That's pretty high. And so you could sort of see the prudence in keeping away from each other.
Right.
But then again, is our society so bored that we can't shelter in place for another month or 2 months or however long it takes to get this thing under control? And I think that once we have a vaccine and once we have a cure, then you're going to start to see things open up. It might not take until 2022. I don't know that that's a realistic number, but you're definitely looking at extended time. You were in the meeting that I was in where we were told that we're looking at basically not having church services at least until June.
Right.
we're friends with Merritt Marsango, who more than likely, because he's retiring, he's retired now. No, he's supposed to retire, I guess, at the end of April, right?
April 30th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he said, the last time we met, he said, I may very well have already preached my last sermon there, which is true, because, who knows? We're definitely not going to go, we're not going to be open before April ends. And we're definitely, I don't know, we're looking in the middle of May, June, July, who knows? So, all right. Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. It's gone in a lot of different directions.
Yes.
I have the distinct pleasure of now editing this down into a half-hour podcast. So, Zach, I want to thank you for joining me today on this discussion. We'll probably get together again, and we'll have another discussion on some topic. Who knows what?
Thanks for inviting me, and it was a pleasure talking to you and sharing my knowledge and my wisdom.
Yep, thank you. And for anybody also who's listening, I want to say, send your questions. Send your questions to PastorBrettUMC@gmail.com, or you can post them on my Guerrilla Christianity Facebook page, and we'll take those questions and we'll address them at a later time. All right, Pastor Zach, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brett. Peace, my friend.
God bless.
All right.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Guerrilla Christianity. My prayer for you is that you have been blessed in its teaching as I have been blessed in putting this message together. God has also blessed me in appointing me to serve 2 churches in Salem County, New Jersey, Ebenezer United Methodist Church in Auburn and Hudson United Methodist Church in Pedricktown. And if you live in the area and you don't have a church to call your own, I'd like to invite you to join us on Sunday mornings. Ebenezer meets for worship at 9 a.m., and Hudson meets for worship at 10:30. We also have Bible study during the week. Right now, during the coronavirus outbreak, we are meeting exclusively online through Facebook Live, and we would be glad to have you join us wherever you are. Now, if you enjoy this podcast and would like to help support it, please share it with your friends and family, hit like, leave a comment, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just search for Guerrilla Christianity. Keep learning, keep growing, and I pray you will join us for Guerrilla Christianity again. Until next time, remember this: Christ died for you. Now go live for Christ.